Imagine for just a moment that you work in a hospital. In fact, you're a manager in the hospital, and not just any hospital, but the intensive care unit. You're responsible for for managing the intensive care unit. Now, you may not be aware of this, but in this country, about 90,000, 100,000 people every day find themselves in intensive care. That works out to about 5 million people every year find themselves in intensive care. The average stay is about 4 days, and survival rate is between 85 and 90% in terms of people that go into intensive care and versus the ones who leave intensive care. Survival rate about 85 to 90%. And when studied, they have found that the typical intensive care unit, the typical patient, about 175 to 200 tasks are performed on that patient each day. So your job as the manager of the intensive care unit is, how do you make sure that each of those tasks are done correctly? Well, the average hospital, of those tasks, usually 90 to 95% of those tasks are done correctly. The error rate is maybe 5% or less, which sounds really good, except sometimes those errors lead to costly mistakes, maybe even to death. So again, your job as head of the ICU is, how do you get all those tasks done correctly? Well, most of the time there'd be two things you would look to do. One, you'd want to hire the very best doctors, the best nurses, the best technicians, and then you'd want to provide them with the best training possible. And even then, there's still an error rate of 3 to 5%. Well, this is the dilemma that Peter Provost found himself in years ago, as he was the head of the ICU at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, one of the best hospitals in the country. How do you get all those tasks done correctly? He had the best doctors, the best nurses, best training, and still there were mistakes. And so he decided to do something that up to that point had never been done before. He created a checklist for every single task that was performed on a patient, a checklist. And after a relatively short period of time, he was able, as a result of that checklist, over a period of, it was over a year, they got that error rate down to 0. Perfect on each of these tasks. What was the difference? Checklist, the use of checklists. So that's the last thing I want to talk about in this module, is the use of checklists, because I've come to believe that in terms of the operations of a business, checklists can be invaluable. I go to a Quick Trip by my house here to buy gas. I go inside. What do I see behind the counter? A checklist. It's on a clipboard. And I asked the person at the counter, I say, hey, I see the checklist. How's that used? He said, every 30 minutes. A manager is responsible for walking the entire store, it's a convenience store, every 30 minutes with that checklist, making sure everything is where it's supposed to be. I go to Chick-fil-A, what do I see? I see checklists. I use my own checklist in my own business for much of what I do in my own consulting practice. I use checklists because checklists allow us to go from doing something 95% right to quite possibly doing it 100%. And that's where I recommend to my clients that they use checklists. It's not where you're failing, but where do you want to go from being near perfect to almost perfect or even perfect? That's what checklists allow us to do. The best book on this topic was written. It's called The Checklist Manifesto, written by Dr. Atul Gawande. If you're looking to really get smart on the use of checklists, that would be the book I would recommend. The Checklist Manifesto. Where are you using checklists today that you want to get better at, become more effective at, maybe get perfect at? Where could you be using checklists today?